All right, so today I'm talking about the next ancestor in this book by Jiryu Abels. An ancestor, I don't think I'd ever heard of him before, or at least not named. And I'm using also the formulation of his name, the Chinese formulation of his name, Matsu, because I think I'd heard some of the koans as stories that come from his life, but I wasn't familiar with this person. And so he took the name, his surname, his from birth was Ma, and then he was given the honorific Tzu, which is the same honorific that's given to Lao Tzu, the purported author of the uh, you know what I'm getting at. So say it. You know what I'm talking about. Okay, senior moment.
Ciao,
Um,
Dei Ching.
yeah, thank you. Yeah, Yao De Jing, thank you. Um, so, and some authors think of him as the beginning of koan practice, and he's perhaps more prominent in the lineage, the Rinzai lineage, than in the Soto lineage. And some of the stories about him have become koans that apparently that appear in the koan curriculum. And koan practice is central to the school of Zen known as Rinzai. And there's a, as I said, a formal curriculum of koans, a series of stories revealing awakening, beginning with the famous question, does a dog have Buddha nature? And in koan study, formal koan study, the student is given a specific koan by the teacher to sit with and contemplate. And then the student meets with the teacher and offers an understanding of the koan. Very frequently, it doesn't meet the teacher's understanding, and the student is dismissed abruptly with no, with a harsh no, and perhaps a bell. And then the student is dismissed for further contemplation, and the student continues to sit with the koan until they are able to give a satisfactory answer, and then they're given the next koan to contemplate. In our tradition, Soto Zen, we don't use koans in the same way. We tend to use them as teaching stories, revealing something about the way of Buddha. They're often stories in which the teacher says something that provokes a sudden understanding, a sudden awakening in the student. And it seems that that's all it takes to break through to a deep understanding. And in fact, it usually these moments, these sort of turning moments, the turning words from the teacher, are actually take place after many years of meditation and study. And then the student goes back to many more years of meditation and study. So even though it seems that it's all that takes to break through, actually it's not. So there are a lot of these kinds of stories about Matsu, but I'll just highlight a couple that stood out for me, and some issues that arose for me as I was thinking about this person and who he was. He lived in 8th century China during the Tang Dynasty, which was a lengthy dynasty of about 200 years, in which the same family, with one large exception, were in power. And Buddhism was very well established and supported by the imperial regime. There were thousands of monasteries for both men and women, and students often moved from one teacher to another, sometimes remaining with one teacher for many years before moving on. Matsu came from a modest background, eventually becoming a student of one of Huineng's Dharma heirs. Huineng is the one that we talked about the last 2 times. And later, he rose to be the head of his own monastery when at the age of 72, which made me feel a lot better because, it took him a long time to find his way to his most profound teachings, most profound understanding and teaching. But he was noted for his very harsh teaching style, using kicks and shouts and employing the predecessor of the euphemistically called encouragement stick, known as kyosaku in Japanese, which is a long, flat stick that is employed in Japanese monasteries to assist the students' alertness in zazen. And the person who's doing that, usually the head student, will walk around behind people as they're facing the wall, and with their permission, and they give permission by bowing and leaning over, and sometimes moving their garments a little bit, and then a quick whack is given on both sides of the shoulders, and this is I'll talk a little bit more about this a little bit later. So the Tang Dynasty had periods of stability and periods of great disruption, including famine, war, and disease, and causing widespread death. And it said that during one period of rebellion, which exacerbated disease and famine, that the population decreased by 2/3, which is incredible to imagine. Similar to the Great Plague in Europe, I think. And in reading about Matsu, I found myself both perplexed and disturbed by his harshness. And here's an example of his behavior towards students who came to inquire about his understanding, about trying to gather a greater understanding. So Venerable Shui Lo came to see the master for the first time. He asked, "What is the meaning of Zen?" The master said, "Bow down." As he bowed down, the master kicked him in the chest. Shui Lo had a great awakening. And Jiryu Abels explains this behavior in a way that I've heard many times. Such harsh treatment was a necessary, skillful means to use to provoke an insight into true nature. And the use of kyosaku became ritualized and formalized and persist in Japan. But I've never seen it used in our lineage, although it was in the past. And I am not, I think that some centers still use it, perhaps not in our lineage, but San Francisco Zen Center stopped using it in the early 90s. I remember first hearing about it from my root teacher, Grace. After her ordination, she began studying koan study with a Japanese Rinzai teacher, Fukushima Roshi, at a temple complex called Tofukuji in Kyoto. And she described her stays during sesshin, during week-long retreats, in very dramatic terms. And she, for example, the monks would sit sitting and walking. I think there were only 2 meals, and they sat from 3 a.m. to 9 or 10 p.m. And their each sitting would be for an hour, and then walking for 5 or 10 minutes. And the kyosaku was used frequently. And she described it as often being very harsh. And once she fainted, and it sounded really terrible to me, really terrible. And I thought, is that what I have to do to become enlightened? I thought to myself, I don't need more suffering. I've got plenty inside this head right here. It's the tofukaji of my own turbulent mind is enough. But these demanding schedules and the use of the Kyosaku and harsh speech have become integral parts of Zen practice as it was originally transmitted to the 20th century America, and some vestiges of it persist. And unfortunately, deep understanding, I'm sorry to say, almost always arises in the context of deep suffering. It's suffering that brings us to practice. And it's certainly been true of my own life. Having had breast cancer at a young age got my attention very strongly, although it didn't at that time turn me towards Zen. But it did turn me towards contemplation of what is most important in life. And then later, after I'd studied Zen for quite a long time, many years, when I was rejected by my teacher, it was which, while a terrible, terrible blow, humbled me in an invaluable way. But I don't think that habitual harsh treatment is routinely skillful means. And I personally have tried not to be harsh, not always succeeding, and sometimes being misunderstood. And I know now that my own tendency towards anger is based in usually hurt and fear. And I've asked myself, is there a difference between anger and harshness? Can one be harsh without being angry? And certainly, sometimes a clear and strong correction is necessary and appropriate. I think that we are, as perhaps as a cohort, perhaps as a culture, very, very sensitive. And for sensitive people, harsh or even strong and clear treatment is traumatic. So we're still finding our way to skillful means and making mistakes. Another aspect of Matsu's heritage is that, or actually his lineage, his teaching, was ordinary mind is the way. His confrontational style was geared like a thunderclap, like a lightning strike, to reveal the realization that Buddha nature is right here, right here. And so maybe that's what that kick was about. Don't ask me theoretical questions or intellectual questions like, what is the meaning of Zen? But just pay attention right now. And don't look further than your own life and your own feet. So here's a quote from writings that are ascribed to him. And this is a teaching. Okay, and this is the teaching about ordinary mind is based on what is known as the Tathagata Garbha doctrine, based in some of the ancient sutras. And this is a quote from his what he wrote about that. No, this is another Zen master writing at the same time. This teaching says that all sentient beings possess the true mind of emptiness and quiescence, whose nature is without inception, fundamentally pure, bright, unobscured, astute, constantly aware. It is called Buddha nature. It is called Tathagata Garbha and mind ground. From time without beginning, it has been concealed by false thoughts. So you might recognize echoes of the Heart Sutra that form as emptiness. But this is really a teaching about the nature of emptiness and its persistence, its unfailing presence. And his teaching is further about turning towards the reality of essential Buddha nature in our own life, in our own experience, not seeking something else, but living our life fully and completely not distracted by greed, hate, and delusion. And it doesn't mean that greed, hate, and delusion are not there. It's not a purification, but it is a realization of the constant presence of Buddha nature. Because Buddha nature is always there, whereas greed, hate, and delusion are always changing. Buddha nature is always there, luminous, spacious, calm, compassionate, wise, and steadfast. And it's this that we sit down and open our heart and mind towards. The secret is turning towards, not away from, our suffering, our anguish, our fear, and our defenses in the form of greed, hate, and delusion. Matz's teachings and teaching style were very influential in Zen, especially Rinzai Zen. In our day and our culture, we're each free to find the approach that works for us, and that's good. And we can each find our way and each express Buddha nature uniquely. The other thing that occurred to me later after I'd written this is that this also talks about the relationship between teacher and student, and the importance of the teacher as a mirror to the student, to help the student see things about themselves that they may be unaware of, and to find the skillful means, whether clear and strong or very gentle and sweet, that's appropriate for each person.